Okay, we've been talking about the flood. We got a week off last week, and the week before we got Noah into the ark with his family. God shut the door. They had 2 of every animal, 7 of some. We covered those for clean animals for sacrificing. And they entered the ark, and the rains came, and floods came, and the earth opened up, and we had a complete flood of the entire earth. Every peak's covered. A little reminder of that in our study tonight. What are some evidences of today of a flood or a catastrophe like that? What can you think of as some evidences that something big happened? Go ahead.
There's ocean rock on the top of our mountain in Montana.
Good point. There's ocean rock. You can find geological differences. And you're like, how did an ocean rock get on top of a mountain? Very good. What else?
Grand Canyon.
Thank you. We have canyons. Mike, awesome. We have canyons. I'm going to show you 2 quick clips, they're about 2.5 minutes each, that talk about 2 things. One is Mount St. Helens. When did Mount St. Helens happen? What year? 1980. And there are canyons at Mount St. Helens. When we look at a canyon, we think of something that's millions of years old. I am not millions of years old. I was alive when Mount St. Helens happened. There's strata at Mount St. Helens. There are fossils at Mount St. Helens. There's all of these evidences of old age at Mount St. Helens. And yet that only happened, do the math, 39 years ago. And so it looks like it was 1,000,000 years ago, but it's not. And so we have evidences that something really big happened. Mount St. Helens gives us some neat illustrations. And then I'm going to show you one on canyons really quickly. And then we'll get to our study. So let me shift over. Turn it off. Back on. Make sure I don't blast your eardrums. Oh, we already saw that one. There we go. First one is Mount St. Helens. Again, it's about 2.5 minutes long. I think it's pretty interesting.
On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens, located 95 miles south of Seattle, Washington, erupted. The eruption was triggered by an earthquake centered beneath the mountain that measured 5.1 on the Richter scale. The lateral blast swept out the north side of Mount St. Helens at 300 miles per hour. With temperatures as high as 660 degrees Fahrenheit and the power of 24 megatons of thermal energy, it snapped 100-year-old trees like toothpicks and stripped them of their bark. Before the famous eruption at Mount St. Helens, scientists were mostly familiar with slow-acting examples of geologic change. But at Mount St. Helens, geologists watched the Earth's surface change quite rapidly. Icebergs were buried in hot avalanche material. They melted and formed badlands in days. Eruptions on May 18 and June 10 produced fine layers in hours. On June 10, mudflows cut zigzag canyons 100 feet deep in soft sand and mud, complete with perpendicular side canyons. Canyons that are reminiscent of the geography of Grand Canyon, only 40 times smaller and clearly produced within hours. Mudflows over the following decade cut hundreds of feet into solid rock in just days of cutting time. Fallen trees formed a log mat on the surface of Spirit Lake and dropped bark to the bottom of the lake, accumulating up to 3 feet of bark peat in just a couple years. And vertically floating logs sinking to the bottom of the lake resulted in buried trees in only a decade. similar to the trees of Yellowstone's fossil forest, which are also buried in volcanic layers. Even though Mount St. Helens is a very small catastrophe compared to the flood or the major catastrophes immediately following the flood, it provides a better clue to what happened in those times than the slow geologic processes which are most commonly seen in the present.
So anything besides canyons catch your attention in that? How about the trees? What were they? Petrified. Petrification does not show age, right? It shows a catastrophic event. We think if something's petrified, it's millions of years old. You got a whole lake of petrified trees that are 39 years old. Okay, so there are some really things makes you start thinking, processing. Again, science wants to tell you there's no way there's an Earth worldwide flood. There's no way the Earth is only 10,000 years old. Wow, stop thinking. All right, I'm going to show you the one on canyons. It expands a little bit on that one. I'll save the Ice Age one for maybe next week. That way we can get to our study. Because I thought the Ice Age was really good.
Surface is scarred by deep canyons, cut into solid rock. But how did they form? A little bit of water over a long time, or a little bit of time with a lot of water? Modern rivers don't generally cut downward into the solid rock, so today's river erosion seems incapable of explaining rock canyons. The Great Flood of the Bible, however, provides a possible explanation for such canyons. In soft mud or sand in your own backyard, you can see the power of heavy rains on a small scale. A rainstorm can create miniature canyons in only minutes. Though these canyons are very small, cut into mud, they share many of the same characteristics as the world's great canyons. On a larger scale, mud flows have also been observed to form these features quickly. At Mount St. Helens, a single mud flow off the mountain carved Engineers Canyon out of soft sediment in a single day, 100 feet deep. And the same thing even happened in solid rock. A series of mud flows created root and step canyons on the front face of Mount St. Helens, cutting hundreds of feet into solid rock over just a few years. We observe canyons being cut into rock today, but only by catastrophic processes. Just imagine how easy it would be to cut massive canyons during and after Noah's flood. Torrential water and mud flows, followed by uplift and heavy rains, created the right conditions to produce the world's canyons. Furthermore, it may have been easier when flood sediments had not fully hardened. Grand Canyon is a good example where we find evidence of catastrophic forces at work. Upstream is evidence of huge lakes. These lakes would never have formed if the canyon were already open below them. However, if these lakes had formed from rains after Noah's flood, and if the pressure of these waters broke through and carved through the recently deposited sediments, then we would expect to find surge deposits downstream. Below Grand Canyon, this is precisely what we find. Evidence of a lot of water cutting over a little bit of time.
All right, so you're armed with some information. If somebody tries to throw it in your face about canyons being proof that something is millions of years old, you say, no, wait a minute. Not necessarily. It's a lot of water over a little bit of time, not a little bit of water over a long time. Did you catch what he said about the rivers? That water runs and runs, but it doesn't cut more into the rock, does it? Something had to cut into the rock first, and then the river came. And so slowly, over time, the rivers do not make more canyons. It's kind of neat. All right, I geek out on stuff like that. Hey, but what do we remember? Genesis is not a book of science. It's not a book of math. We can have fun with it, and I think it's important for us to study some science behind it. But it's not intended to be a science book, nor is it intended to be a math book. It's a history book. It tells us the history of man, of us. It tells us where we come from. It tells us where the creation comes from. It tells us where God starts, and God really doesn't, because God is eternal. So, this is what the story is about. We believe very clearly here at our church that we had 6 24-hour days of creation. We stand on that literal interpretation because morning and evening means a day. Okay, it means a day. And Yom is obviously, in that context, a day in Hebrew. And so we do believe in 6 24-hour creation days. We believe that God created everything from nothing. He spoke everything into existence. We believe He created the earth, the atmosphere, the water, the land, the plants, the animals, the birds, the fish. And we believe He created it all for us. All for His greatest creation, man. We know that man is the only part of creation that has a living soul. Animals do not have living souls. Only man does. And so only man can relate to God. And only man can live for eternity, because we're spiritual beings. Obviously, man is flawed, not because of God, but because man chose to sin against God. Adam and Eve had one rule, and one rule only, and that was stay away from that silly tree. Don't eat of it. And then Satan was able to tempt, and thankfully, we are allowed to make decisions, but they chose poorly. Cain chose poorly, and so his line degenerated. We saw that already. Thankfully, God gave a third son to Adam and Eve, and that was Seth. We walked through his line, and we realized that if you interpret that literally, it's about 1,656 years from the time that Adam and Eve had Cain or had Seth until, no, it was right before Adam and Eve, or right before Seth, 1656, from the time they had their children until the flood. 1,656 years. And those people lived how long on average? Remember? About 900 years. Who lived the longest? Methuselah. How long did he live? 969. Why could he not be 970? The flood came. Always remember that. All right? He couldn't be any older because the flood came. And most believe that he died before the flood, not in the flood. And most scholars believe that. So, again, some neat little trivia points from the book of Genesis. But we know, obviously, that the world had declined over 1,600 years to the point that everybody and everything was wicked, with the exception of one man, and that was Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. We'll continue to talk about him tonight. It cannot be lost on us that it took 6 days to create everything, and it only took 7 to destroy it. Okay? It took 6 days to create everything, it only took 7 to destroy it. In 7 days, the water covered every peak on the earth. So, okay, let's go to chapter 8 and continue on in this long deployment that Noah found himself on, and I'll explain that here in a few minutes. Genesis chapter 8, and it's not the longest of chapters, so we'll get through it fairly quickly this evening. Genesis 8, it says, the floodwaters have covered the earth for 150 days at this point. It says, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock with him in the boat. He sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the floodwaters began to recede. The underground waters stopped flowing, and the torrential rains from the sky were stopped. So the floodwaters gradually receded from the earth. After 150 days, exactly 5 months from the time the flood began, the boat came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. 2.5 months later, as the waters continued to go down, other mountain peaks became visible. After another 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the boat and released a raven. The bird flew back and forth until the floodwaters on the earth had dried up. He also released a dove to see if the water had receded and it could find dry ground. But the dove could find no place to land because the water still covered the ground. So it returned to the boat, and Noah held out his hand and drew the dove back inside. After waiting another 7 days, Noah released the dove again. This time the dove returned to him in the evening with a fresh olive leaf and its beak. Then Noah knew that the floodwaters were almost gone. He waited another 7 days, then released the dove again. This time it did not come back. Noah was now 601 years old. On the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began, the floodwaters had almost dried up from the earth. Noah lifted back the covering of the boat and saw the surface of the ground was drying. 2 more months went by, and at last the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, "Leave the boat, all of you, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Release all the animals, the birds, the livestock, and the animals that scurry along the ground, so they can be fruitful and multiply throughout the earth." So Noah, his wife, and his sons and their wives left the boat. And all of the large and small animals and birds came out of the boat, pair by pair. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrificed as burnt offerings the animals and birds that had been approved for that purpose. And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent towards evil from childhood. I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night." Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the truth that lies within it. Thank you for the opportunity to draw on that truth and make application in our hearts tonight. I just ask that you'll bless our study. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Before I go, anything that you caught out of the reading that maybe caught your attention? Anything stick out? Nothing. Nada. That's it. And I'm not going to read it for you again. All right. Well, as I read this passage, I was reminded of the days in the Navy back in the 90s. During the 4 years that I was assigned to my submarine, I spent a total of 2.5 years on the water. Now, I admit, compared to our brothers in arms in the Army and the Marine Corps, our deployments were fairly short. The typical fast attack submarine went out for 6 months at a time. The Army deployments are about 12 plus months at that time, so obviously I got to be careful now that I'm in the Army not to make comparisons, so I won't do that. But I want you to imagine being in a vessel at sea, and everywhere you look, you see nothing but water. Has anybody ever been out in the ocean that far? Okay, a couple of you. How does it feel? Thank you, Becky. Exactly, that's how I would feel. You feel ever so small and so tiny and so insignificant. Nothing but water everywhere you look. It's okay for a day. It's okay for 2 days, 3 days. The longer it goes, the tougher it gets. There's miles and miles of air above you, miles of water below you, because some of the parts of the ocean are miles deep. And there's miles and miles of water around you. There's nowhere to set your feet. So it can get unnerving. The longest that we would stay out, about 60 days. 60 days, and our limiting factor was food. We'd run out of food at 60 days. So we would have to either go into port and get food, or we'd have to have somebody bring us some in a helicopter or a surface ship to bring us out food. So we would go about 60 days out there isolated in the water, and that was very significant. That was a pretty tough life. In order to keep you from going crazy, they work you to death. So that makes it even harder. You work long days, you sleep a very little bit, and so again, you have to work each other very hard so that you don't lose your mind when you're that far at sea. And I thought I had it bad. How many days could they not see land? Remember, they had an 18-inch opening along the top of that ark, so they could look out and see. How many days did you catch it? 150. 150 for 5 months. Anytime they looked out of that ship, and they went all the way around so they could see all the way around, anytime they looked out, they saw nothing but the horizon. No land in sight for 5 months. That would drive you crazy. I mean, if you stop and think about it, that is something else. It's just insane when you stop and think about it. And again, how small would you feel? Okay, how small would you feel? So I thought about that when I read through this. I thought, wow, I thought I had it tough. But no, and yes, just for note, the longest I ever spent under the water was 52 days straight. So I went a month and some change without coming above the water. That was kind of unique. Okay, so I have experienced some of that, but not 152 days. That's a third of what they did. So that's, when you stop and picture that, that's a big deal. Okay, so we're going to talk about this and talk it through and get some reminders of what we had. What was this? Anyway, this was the wrath of God. That's our first point. And let me get my clicker. This is just a little quick review. The flood was the wrath of God. Okay, the flood was the wrath of God. We've already discussed this in pretty much detail, or a lot of detail. The universal flood, the flood of the entire earth, was the wrath of God. It's not a knee-jerk reaction of an angry deity. God was patient for 1,600 years. I mean, He allowed this degeneration to go on. And even in the end, if you recall, He had not given up. Because even after 1,600 years, Noah was still preaching. Noah was still sharing God's truth about sin, about judgment, about righteousness. And so that was still going out all the way to the end of that time. And so God was not just simply being angry, God was being righteous. A couple of things that we did learn that we must keep on the forefront. Everything was covered. It was reiterated in our passage in chapter 8. Everything was covered. Does anybody remember how high it was above the tallest peaks? Thank you, Kara. 22 feet. All right. So apparently the ark drafted something less than 22 feet. That's why it's 22 feet. So the ark would not drag while it was going through the water. Okay, so you had 22 feet, and plus, there's nobody 22 feet tall. So nobody was going to stand on something while the flood was there. So that guaranteed that everybody except those in the ark died. As you heard, they stayed in it for 150 days. I thought about this. Does that mean Mount Everest was covered? Yeah, Mount Kilimanjaro. Yeah. You start talking about really high peaks when you consider this. I would be of the school that the geology of the earth changed dramatically at the flood. And so it's kind of hard to say what Mount Everest looked like and what Mount Kilimanjaro looked like back then. Things may have changed. But again, the rule of thumb, it was 150 days completely covered, 22 feet above every peak. Another thing to be reminded of, everything died. I mean, everything died. As we talked last week, there were probably millions of people on the planet at this time, over 1,600 years, with people living up to 900 years, up to 969 years, and reproducing offspring all of that time. The multiplication factor is insane. And so you can't even imagine. It had to be millions and millions of people, and only 8 were spared. And so guess what was in the water? The other millions minus 8. Again, we don't put those on the kids' coloring sheets, but they were there. The bodies were in the water, and they would have been their friends, their relatives, their in-laws, their people they knew. And so this had to be a really tough situation for them. Okay? Only 8 people that would survive. And so there's the truth. That's the wrath of God. We have to be careful what we picture God as here, as again being just some angry deity. No. I had to stop and think about it, how God had to feel when His creation, the human race, was rebelling against Him. Most of us are parents here or have been around parents. You know, how do you feel if the police shows up and tell you your son's been arrested? How do you feel if he's been involved in armed robbery? How do you feel if he's been involved in murder? You'd be completely heartbroken, wouldn't you? Well, how do you think God felt when His creation did these things? Again, maybe your daughter. Maybe you find out your daughter has run away with a guy twice her age. And how do you feel when she's gone against your wishes and gone against the way you told her to live? You're crushed. You're not just angry, you're heartbroken. And so we don't need to picture God as an angry God, but a heartbroken God. That's what the Scripture says. He was heartbroken over the way men and women had become so wicked. So it's important for us to understand that no, God is not just knee-jerking in this situation. This is the wrath of a heartbroken God. He was heartbroken by what his creation had done. Now, he is also a God of love, as we learn. The ark was the grace of God. The flood is the wrath of God, and the ark is the grace of God. Remember, this is a history book. It's telling us the history of how God reacts to sin and how God reacts to righteousness. God's wrath comes upon sin. God's grace comes upon the righteous. And so we have the grace of God in the flood. We won't go too far in that. We've talked about that already. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. As a result, he, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives were spared. But, and this is what struck me in this study, and this is kind of the meat of the study, it was not a cushy rescue, was it? How do you think it was living in that ark all that time? How long anybody do the math? How long were they actually physically in the boat that's only 450 feet long, a football field and half a football field wide, and 3 levels tall? How long were they actually in the boat from the day they walked in till the day they walked out? Over a year?
About 11 months.
12 and a half months. Because he said it was 10 and a half months from the time it started, and they stayed 2 more months even after the birds stayed gone. That's a long time in a small space, even with people you love. Okay? Even with people you care about. Again, those 52 days underwater on that submarine with 110 men in a football field long, not being able to get away from each other is the worst thing possible. Even if you like each other, 52 days in a football field long too was a long time. 12 and a half months only being able to get 450 feet apart. That's incredible. And do you think it smelled very good? At least I had air conditioning, right? I had air conditioning. I had food that was replenished. I had some comforts. They had nothing. And can you imagine what that thing smelled like? Oh, I cannot fathom. This is a floating zoo. A literal. You've been to the zoo in the hot summer months, right? Ew. What do you think that boat smelled like? And do you think if there's only 8 people and there's 450 foot of animals 3 stories high, do you think they got a break very often? They had to constantly be working so that the boat didn't fill up, right? They had to constantly be cleaning the boat out. Like if you got horses in a barn, you know what I'm talking about. Okay? They had to clean this thing every day, all day long. They had to have a routine, right? On who's going to take the upper deck, who's going to take the lower deck. And they had to be working around the clock. This was not a cushy rescue, right? It was not a cushy rescue. Again, our children's church coloring sheets fail us again. I can't picture smiles on the faces of Noah and his family. Yes, they're rescued, but it was not an easy path. I was reminded, and it was funny because somebody posted something today along this line. Noah and his family were saved through the flood, not from it. It's an important concept. They were saved through the flood, not from it. They were rescued, but it wasn't without struggle on their own. It wasn't easy. I think many times we have a misconception that God's grace should completely remove us from our troubles. We think if God is good, and if we are following God and we are being righteous, just as Noah was being righteous, we think that we wouldn't have to endure such hardship. But that's not the case, is it? Yes, He rescues us. Yes, He promises us things, but He doesn't promise to remove us from the flood. He promises to rescue us through it. Think about this, and this is that to me was the heart of the discussion. How do you think they felt at 12 and a half months when the door dropped and they stepped on grass? How do you think they felt? I mean, do you think they were smiling at that point? Oh, wow. I don't think you could take the smile off their face. Because I remember being gone 6 months and pulling into a pier, and you finally tie up on that pier and you put the brow across and you step your feet off of the boat and onto the pier. You just forget the last 6 months. that isolation, that hard work, it's all behind you because who's on the pier? Your family. And I stopped and thought about that. When we consider what God rescues us from in life, a lot of times it's really, really hard. He still allows us to struggle. He still allows us to go through the flood. We've got to keep the picture in mind of when that plank drops. And who are we going to see when we step foot on the other side? I stopped and thought about that. I'd see my mom. I see my dad. I see my grandma. I see friends. I see other relatives. Do you think the trouble behind me is going to be in my mind anymore? No, not at all. At that point, it's all forgotten, because the joy that comes after the waters recede is far greater than the suffering in the water. And to me, that's the picture. Again, this is a history book, not a science book, not a math book. God is teaching us, right? His wrath brings pain, but His grace brings rescue through the flood, not from it. And so if we can keep a picture, if you get nothing else out of this study, get the picture of them dropping that door at 12 and a half months and them stepping out. That's the picture of our rescue. Yes, we're in the ark of Jesus Christ. And when we die, we will step out of that ark and into perfection. Then it'll all be behind us. And that's how we endure the flood. That's how we get through the hard times, is remembering that the water will recede. Okay? Now, let's move on. The ark was entered by faith, and this is the connection. This is the connection to history, to our theology. The ark was entered by faith. The positive side of the historical narrative is very clear. Noah found grace through faith. And that's not a New Testament concept, as some will tend to believe. It's been true since the beginning of time. We will find out when we get to Abraham. How was Abraham counted as righteousness? By faith. Okay? It's always been by faith. And so we learn from the author of Hebrews, this one nice passage, I know I've referred to it at least one other time. We learn that it was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who warned him about things that had never happened before, like rain. By his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith. The key word in the passage is faith. In the Greek to Hebrew, it's also translated to believe. They're interchangeable. Faith and belief, in most cases, can be interchangeable. And so his faith is what helped him to build the ark. Can you imagine how much faith it had to take to build a boat 450 feet long? And he is already 500 years old. I mean, that took a lot of faith. They'd never seen rain before. And I'm sure this was high up enough that it wasn't close to the water, because had it been, it wouldn't have survived the flood. And so on this dry ground, he's building this great big boat. That took faith. That took a lot of faith, just as the passage says. And when you stop and think about it, that is powerful. Faith overcame the flood for him and his family. Faith will overcome our things like peer pressure, tough situations, difficult surroundings. I just thought of so many things that bring about the floods in our life. And when you stop and think about it, what preserved him from the flood was his faith. And it's the same for us. It hasn't changed. Genesis always all the way to Revelation. It is a matter of faith. Now, I thought about something practical when I looked at this. This passage and the previous passages actually gives us some tangibles. What were the evidences of Noah's faith? How do we know he was a person of faith? All right? First, his close fellowship with God. He was a man of faith that allowed him to have close fellowship with God. Remember, this is the creation story. God created man for fellowship. God, in the beginning, had constant fellowship with Adam and Eve, unbroken fellowship. In other words, he was always present. And they were always in his presence. And that's what God desires of his creation. Sin broke that. God still desires it, even though sin has entered the world, and God makes provision so that we can have that relationship with him. So even after sin had broken the relationship with the line of man, still later, 1656 years later, and the whole world is wicked, and an individual can still have fellowship with God. That tells you it doesn't depend upon your circumstance. It doesn't depend upon your situation. It doesn't even depend upon your temptation. By faith, you have fellowship with God. And we can have the same. What's that fellowship look like today? That fellowship looks like prayer, consistent in our prayer life, communicating with God, fellowshipping with Him through prayer. It looks like studying His Word, or reading His Word regularly, because that's how He communicates with us. That's fellowship with God. It means being in His house among other believers. That's fellowshipping with each other as we fellowship with God. That's what it looks like to have faith. We don't do these things to be right with God, but if we're right with God by faith, then we will desire these things. We will desire communication through prayer, we'll desire through His study of His Word, and we'll desire through the fellowship of believers to be close with God, if by faith we're right with God. The other we see obedience to God's commands. A sign of faith or evidence of faith is obedience to God's commands. Several times so far in this passage, we read, Noah did everything God told him. Now, was Noah perfect? Everybody shake your head no, he was not perfect. We're going to find that out in our next study, just how imperfect he is. He was righteous by God through faith, but he wasn't perfect. But he was obedient. Okay? He was obedient to God. Remember, that was a crazy plan. He heard some really crazy things. He's going to what? It had never rained before. And this stuff had to be crazy, but he was obedient. And when God said, hey, all the animals are just going to show up, you put them on the ark, got it, God. All right? When he gets in the ark, God says, it's time to shut the door. Move your fingers. God shut the door. He was obedient to God's commands. And so when we stop and think about it, evidences of our faith would be obviously the fellowship, but also the obedience to God's command. If we're people of faith, we'll be obedient to God, to God's Word. And finally, he worshipped God. This is significant I've read it for years and it never really caught my attention until a few years ago when I did this series on a Sunday morning. Actually, it's been more than a few years ago. It's 2007. 12 years ago. You stop and think about it. What was the first thing he did? We learned it tonight. When he stepped off of that ark, what did he do? Say it louder, Kara. I see it. He built an altar, and what did he do? What did it require for a sacrifice? He had to kill the animals he just preserved for a year and 12 and a half months. These are the only breathing things on the planet, and he killed them. That's worship. He was giving God what God expected, even in light of the scarceness of these creatures on the planet. He trusted God would continue the multiplication. So he actually killed some of the only animals that were alive in order to sacrifice to God. That was a tremendous offering. And yet we complain about 10%. He gave, this was going to be food. We're going to discuss it next time. This was his food he was giving to God. Up to this point, they were vegetarians. We're going to find that God's going to give them permission to eat meat next. And so this would have been table food for him. So he had to wait now until they reproduced because he sacrificed them to God. The clean animals that he could have eaten, he sacrificed to God. So that's significant. That's giving God your very, very best. And that's a sign of faith. He had faith to offer God, before God produced from the ground, he had faith to offer God the best offering he possibly could. So he was a man who worshiped God. So, bottom line was faith does not save. It never has. Works do not save. Faith saves alone. Works do not. Only by faith. And if there is faith, then there will be evidences of that faith. And we talked about it not too long ago, Sunday morning. You say you have faith. James says, I'll show you my faith now. Not my works. I'm going to be showing faith through the way I live and through the way I serve. I will show faith by my works. Now, it's kind of nice that he made a promise. What was the promise? Never to flood the earth again. But was that a promise that there would never be consequences? What did he say? This is neat. Did you catch this? He says, as long as the earth remains. Is there a day coming when the earth will not remain? Yep, we just studied Revelation. So no, he's not going to flood the earth. He's going to destroy it with large hailstones, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, fire. It's going to flatten every mountain. It's going to shake every island. And there's going to be what? A new heaven and a new earth. Why? Because the old earth The old will pass away. So this is kind of eerie. Yes, he promised not to flood it with water again, but he didn't promise he wasn't going to destroy it. He said until the earth, or as long as the earth remains, you will guard it. And you notice he said there will be spring and summer, winter and fall. We get really worried about that, don't we? God made that promise in Genesis that we'd have 4 seasons. And we're worried about changing them. Okay? That's for another day. All right, Beth, can we get our song? We're going to close with... Okay, can we find it? Yes, 31. My Jesus, I love thee. Would you stand with us, please? My Jesus, I love thee. I know thou art mine. For thee all the follies of sin I resign. My gracious Redeemer, my Savior art thou. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. I love thee because thou hast first loved me, and purchased my pardon on Calvary's tree. I love thee for wearing the thorns on my brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. I love thee in life, I will love thee in death, and praise thee as long as thou lendest me breath, and say when the dead do lies cold on my brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. In mansions of glory and endless delight, I'll ever adore thee in heaven so bright. I'll sing with the victory crown on my brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. Thanks for coming. Appreciate you. Look forward to seeing you Sunday. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning of verse 6, going all the way through the end of chapter 4, verse 21, will be our next study. Looking forward to that. Share that with you, Lord willing, Sunday morning. And then Sunday night, we'll be back to our life groups and our study with Ray Vanderlaan up here. Again, so anxious for that. So do keep all your prayer that we gave you there real close to you. But remember Park and remember the Michaels family. That's scary. To have your teenage son in that situation. Just praying to God to kill the infection in his bone and to just keep it from coming back. That's, again, I've had teenagers. I know what that would be like. So many of you do as well. Okay, Mike, would you close us in prayer?
We thank you for your understanding word. Thank you, Lord, that you are a God